This morning I mentioned to you that I should probably call this series for today, or this month, the sermons that Brian can't finish in one session. And we're kind of trying to split some things up. And then I didn't even finish this morning. I didn't even get through that. But I'm going to rehash those things. I want to bounce a little bit and talk a little bit more about this idea with you tonight. About life's all about choices and decision making that we have to make, and that we were born upright, right? And God created us in His image. And we talked in our early study this morning out of Ecclesiastes how the writer there talked about the idea that man was designed for uprightness, but we chose or sought out many devices or many sinful paths. And we talked about the destructive nature of that in our study this morning, and the challenges that besets and brings to each of us in that decision-making process, and reminded ourselves that sin is a choice. Right? It's not something that's born within us. It's not something we have to do. It's not something that we cannot escape. Sin is something that we choose in relationship to it. And I want to continue a little bit this evening talking about this particular subject, and think a little bit here in just a moment about that text out of Ephesians chapter 2 that Aaron just read for us. But here's the struggle we have sometimes with the idea of sin, and that is, if it feels right to me, then eventually even sinful practices can become normal. They can begin to feel natural in some senses. They feel like the norm and the path that I should be walking in. Just notice with me a couple of thoughts here in Ephesians chapter 2. And I want you to notice there's an interesting moment. I don't know whether you caught it or not when we read through that, when Aaron read it, because it almost sounds contradictory to what I talked to you about this morning, doesn't it? Because in verse 3 of Ephesians chapter 2, he says, "Among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others." Now, how can that be? If our nature is the image of God, Genesis chapter 1 through 3, if our nature is uprightness, what the Ecclesiastes writer had to say about that subject when we about it this morning, in what fashion or in what way is it possible then that Paul could speak here in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 3 that they had a nature that had a propensity to the flesh and the sins of it? And let me suggest to you that I think the description he's making here is the idea that any sin eventually feels natural to the sinner. That's the concept he's trying to get them to see. Their former lives, their former conduct, their former behaviors felt natural. That is the scariest place to get with sin. When sin begins to feel the natural response and reaction that I should have, rather than the uprightness and righteousness of God, that's a scary place to be. And it took the love of Jesus and His sacrifice for sin to be able to provide for them an answer to get out of this children of wrath mindset. And by the way, just for those who might think, well, maybe he is talking about their own nature. Well, think about the consequence of that position when he says they were by nature children of wrath. What were they by nature of? Not by nature sinners, not by nature they were forced into certain behaviors, but they chose a nature that led them to become children of wrath. The wrath of whom? The wrath of God. And so before we buy into this idea, well, see, here's a moment where even your nature can go ahead and go towards sin because it's just your nature. Well, no, that puts you into the wrath of God path, and I don't think any of us want to find ourselves there. He's talking still about the idea of choice, but he's talking about it in a way here the Apostle Paul is that we have developed ourselves and thought of ourselves and made choices in our lives in such a way that even sin becomes natural. But notice the interjection, verse 4, but God. How do you change the course and path and direction of anything that's difficult, sinful, leading us to wrath? You interject God. You interject God, right? But God, who is rich in mercy because of His great love with which He loved us even when we were dead. Again, you want to choose that nature. It leads to wrath and it leads to death. I don't think I want to stay in that nature. The choice of a nature that led me to sin, or the choices of sin. Because of His great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. I chose to adopt what was sinful as my natural response to things. I chose sinful directions and thought of it as just my nature, and it led me to the wrath of God if it undealt with, if unrepentant, and it leads me to understand that only the grace of God can lead me out of that. People convince themselves that if it feels right to me, if it feels natural to me, then it's got to be okay. And that's not at all a biblical principle. It's a human principle, and it's a worldly principle, and it's a common principle among men, that if it feels right to you, then that's all that really matters. What feels natural or compelling to you, if it feels like something you choose or desire to choose, then that's all that's really necessary in that thinking process or that choice process. But certainly we should be giving more heed to what God has to say about what's natural and what isn't. Romans chapter 1 dealt with that in our brief moment in that text this morning. Notice with me in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 4. He said, in regard to these, they think it strange. Here's what the world thinks of you when you live God's nature. The world thinks it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. Brother and friend, can I get us to understand this principle? When you live the uprightness of God, the nature that is within you, you're going to be the strange one in the world. Not the strange one to God, but you're going to be the strange one in the eyes of the world, because the world has adopted the nature of wrath out of Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 3. The world has adopted the trespasses and sins that have led them into the consequence of God. They have chosen things that they've decided are natural to them, and so anyone who lives uprightly looks strange. I can't change that. I can't change the reality that man will always, in many senses, has always viewed uprightness as the oddity. But not so among the believers. Among the believers, among those who have built their faith and convictions in the Creator, among those who have made the choice to honor and serve the Lord, they recognize that their nature is uprightness, and if that looks strange to the world, so be it. Because I want to choose behaviors and paths that God would approve of, not that which is of the world. Sin can be betrayed so natural that it makes the Christian look like the odd one in this world of sin that we have to exist in. And yet Peter reminds us here that do not choose to run with them just because it looks like that's the way we ought to go. Do not choose to lend your voice and your behaviors and your walk with those who are running towards wickedness just because you don't want to feel strange. You can illustrate that in a lot of different ways. I heard one fella illustrate that by talking about an elevator. When you get on an elevator, what do? You go on an elevator and you turn around. I guarantee you want to look strange? Walk in an elevator and stare at everybody for all 62 floors that you're going. Walk in the elevator and just stare at them. Stand facing the people that are on there rather than doing what you're supposed to do. And get on the elevator, look at the button, turn around. Face the door. That's what you're supposed to do, right? And anybody that doesn't do that, you actually think are what? Strange. In fact, if that happened to you, when that guy got off the elevator, you'd look at anybody that was with you and you'd say, what? Well, that was strange. That was odd. But brethren, I'm simply trying to illustrate to you that that's the way you're going to look to the world all the time. To the world, uprightness will look like the guy that doesn't know better than to turn around inside an elevator. We're going to look different. It's a choice. To live in the upright paths of God and have to realize that at times we're not going to look and feel and the world isn't going to view us with sympathetic eyes. Because uprightness is not natural to them, because they've chosen a nature of wrath and disobedience and ignorance towards the will of God. It looks strange to them because we do not run in the same fashion, in the same circles, in the same behaviors. I've got to embrace the fact that living upright, choosing uprightness, is going to make me look odd to the world. But upright in the eyes of God, which is what really matters. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17. Here's what I want you to notice. Paul says, "This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart." I want you to pause for a moment there and think about that with me. Those who choose sin, those who choose to reject God's uprightness, those who choose to put aside the image that God has created us in and the nature of uprightness that He has adopted us to as created beings of His, those who abandon that are actually those who have alienated themselves from the life that God has extended to them. What does sin do to me? It alienates me from God. Yes, there is a remedy in Jesus. Yes, there is an answer provided through the grace of God. Yes, there is salvation and justification through grace by faith. All of that is true. But not to the intent of allowing us to continue in sin, not to allow us to continue to adopt the ways and passions of the world. God says those who continue in the walk of the Gentiles are walking in the futility of their minds. Their understanding is darkened. They have alienated themselves from the life that God is trying to offer unto them. Their ignorance, he said, has blinded their hearts. And here's the scary part, verse 19, who being past feeling have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. You know what the saddest state or condition anybody can get into spiritually when they're lost in sin? Is the I don't care mode. When people get into the mode of I don't care if it's sin. I don't care if you say it condemned me. I don't care if you say your God will condemn me for that. I don't care if it alienates me from God. I don't care if I'm lost in you. I don't care. That's hardness of heart, right? That's the hardness of heart in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 20, where somebody just decides, it doesn't matter to me. In verse 19, I should say. It doesn't matter to me what consequence will come. It doesn't matter to me, or I don't even believe there is a consequence. That's the scariest place for anybody to get spiritually, because those folks are hard to walk away from that. The hardness of heart that sets in the lives of so many are the ones that are so hard then to penetrate with the gospel because they don't care. They're not concerned about the condemnation that's coming because of their sinful choices. They're not concerned about the difficulty. It feels right to me. It feels right to me. And even that which God has said is unnatural begins to feel natural to these folks, and they harden their sins. And then I ask the question, why then do we give credit to sinners as being the authority on the natural and the unnatural? Right? Why am I giving any kind of validity to those who have blinded themselves to the life that God is offering to them? They've hardened their hearts against the ways and purposes of God. They have no desire to live uprightly in the eyes of God. And then here we are as Christians giving preference to what they think about what's natural and unnatural. That's a mistake. I'm just trying to challenge us to think about that. That's a mistake. I don't want to give validity to the voice of those who have rejected God to then come back and tell me what is natural and unnatural. I'm going to listen to the God who created me. I'm going to listen to the God who designed me, purposed me. Our Ephesians 2 account, who made me His workmanship in verse 10. We've got to commit ourselves, brethren and friend, as believers. And again, that's who I'm in some ways talking to today. I mean, we can have conversations with the world and their lost condition. That's in some ways a separate conversation. I'm talking about those who are trying to choose life in God. I'm talking to those who desire to believe in God as the Creator. I'm talking to those who have said, I believe in the God of the Bible. That's who I'm challenging today. Because if we can't get our mind right about the uprightness that is founded only in God, then how are we going to encourage anybody out of sin? How are we going to encourage anybody to look for the life that God has to offer? If we haven't dedicated ourselves to that same end and purpose. So many says, it feels right to me. I want to know what feels right to God. Because that's the uprightness of the nature that God has instilled within me. This is the correct response. Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 and verse 9. How do I respond then to that which is unnatural based in biblical principle? Well, no thank you, right? That's the politest way I can say that. There are more bold ways I could say that, but no thanks. I don't have any desire to have anything that's against my nature. I don't desire to have anything that's against the uprightness that God has instilled in me. Verse 9, Romans chapter 12. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Wow, isn't that simple? Isn't that thought so simple? Abhor. Abhor. That's a strong word, by the way. Abhor what is evil. Cling to that which is good. That's what my nature is driving me towards. But what happens then is I have to push that nature aside and push it out of my mindset. Go back to Ephesians chapter 4. They had removed God from their mindset. They weren't thinking about Him, the uprightness that He offered. They'd hardened their hearts. Why? So that I can push aside that nature that God had instilled in me, because I want to adopt this new nature of wrath. I want to adopt this new nature of disobedience. I want to take on this nature of sin so that I don't abhor the very things that I'm doing and behaving and choosing. But the real answer, the natural response to sin, is I don't want any part of that. That's the natural response. I'm pausing because I want you to let that sink into your minds. The natural response. Because we've been programmed to believe that the natural response to sin is to give in to it. We've behaviorally been taught by those around us and the temptations people set before us that the natural response to sin and temptation and all the things it offers is to just step right into it. And that I have to resist and fight my very nature in order to not. No. Just start reversing that thinking a little bit. No, my nature wants me to abhor evil. My nature, my image, the creative power that's within me wants me to stay away from sin. I'm actually fighting against myself when I step into sin. No thanks is the natural response. We don't always successfully do that. I admit that, recognize that. That's why we need the grace of God. That's why Jesus died. Because that's not what we always choose. But just recognize that when I don't choose uprightness, when I choose sin, it's against my nature. For it is shameful, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 12, for it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. He talks about the sins and corruption, the darkness that was among those folks in verse 8. Those who had rejected the fruits of the Spirit. He said it's shameful to even speak about those things that so many are even doing in the darkness. No thanks. Even if it feels right to some, even if they try to obligate us, even though they might view us as strange, that we may feel like the odd ones. Because, friends, of course the sinner wants to portray his conduct in the best light he can. Right? The world wants us to view their choices and behaviors in the best light possible, so obviously they're going to try to get us to think differently about sin. Satan doesn't have to get us to just go flying into sinful choices. What he just does is he just tries to slowly get us to think differently about it. He slowly tries to get us to think differently about what's natural and what's unnatural, and what's sinful and what isn't sinful, what's evil and what's good. And if he can rewire the way we think about what's evil and good, then he can move us and direct us into the choices and paths of sin that create challenges for us. And then we begin to sear that conscience, and now, as we spoke earlier, we're in deeper trouble than we were begun with. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 8. The Hebrew writer's compelling arguments towards this Hebrew audience that he's trying to encourage here in this letter. Verse 8, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion in the day of trial in the wilderness. Don't do what your heritage did. Don't harden your hearts in those moments. Rather, verse 13, exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. That's important. I want to reread that because I want you to think about it with me for a minute. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any one of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. We need to be encouraging one another in uprightness daily. Did you notice that? We need to be lifting each other up in uprightness on a regular basis, reminding each other of what God desires from us, and that our choices of righteousness are not without merit. Our choices to live honorably in the eyes of God have value and importance. That we're making good and positive choices that lead us to eternal benefit when we're following after God. And we need to be doing, and I know I said we, I didn't say you, I said we. We need to be doing a better job exhorting one another in that which is good. Have you ever thought somebody that always seems to talk about Jesus as being the odd one? I'm not trying to trick you here. I'm just trying to. Have you ever seen somebody's Facebook page and they don't say anything but things about the Lord? They don't talk about anything else. You see them post and they don't say anything else. Everything they talk about is about the Lord. And you think, well, that's odd. Why is that odd? Right? Why would that be odd? Right? 62,000 cat videos. That's odd. Praising the Lord every day through whatever venue you have, whatever voice you have, whatever mechanism you have, in whatever way feels comfortable to you, in whatever, right? Isn't that what he's trying to say there in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13? Exhort one another daily? Why is that? Because I need to be encouraged to do what's right sometimes, and so do you. Sometimes I need to be encouraged. I have to be motivated, led to, invited to consider what is good sometimes. I have to remind myself that the world doesn't have to win today. I have to be reminded on a daily basis and find ways to encourage people to appreciate that. And all of us can have a role in that. That's the point I'm trying to make. All of us can have a role in trying to exhort one another daily. To not let our consciences become so overwhelmed by the sins and hypocrisies of the world that we begin to think that's what's natural. The world speaks in hypocrisies and lies, but notice verse 2 of 1 Timothy chapter 4. He said, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. Friends, can I encourage you, don't get to that state or condition. It may feel right to somebody, it doesn't make it right. It may feel natural to them. It may feel like what they think is fitting for them doesn't make it so. And let's exhort and encourage one another every day to appreciate that uprightness is what we all should be seeking. We talked about Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 4 this morning, right? And that's when he talks about the idea that the father that sins is accountable, the son that sins is accountable. The father doesn't pass that on to the son there in Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 4. And I simply want to ask this quick question tonight. How do we get here then? How do we get into this mindset that somehow we're not born to uprightness, we're born to something else? And maybe it starts in this concept of, well, it's environment, the things that I had to live through. Now, I'm not by the way, I'm not trivializing that. Right? The environments and behaviors that are around us have a tremendous impact on the kinds of choices and decisions we make. It may not help, but it's not excuse, and it's not everything in the equation. Even if the circumstances that we find ourselves in, the situations we find ourselves in, are not good, there are still choices to be made. In the Genesis account, in Genesis chapter 39 and verse 9, Joseph is serving in Potiphar's house. You recall the account here in Genesis 39. Verse 9, he says, "There is no one greater in this house than I," speaking of himself, Joseph says, "nor has he," Potiphar, "kept back anything from me but you," speaking about Potiphar's wife. "Because you are his wife, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin," I love this, "and sin against God?" Now that's not to say that this wouldn't have been a sin against himself, that it wouldn't have been a sin against Potiphar's wife, and certainly would have been a sin against Potiphar himself. But what I love about Joseph's mindset is sin is first and foremost always a God problem. It's what severs me from God. It's what distances me from God. It's what causes conflict in my relationship with God. It is a problem between myself and God, first and foremost, always. Yes, it has earthly consequences. Yes, forgiveness may need to be sought. Yes, repentance may need to take place. All of that is true. But Joseph teaches me a valuable lesson here. He didn't want to sin against God. Why? Because he understands he's in God's image. He understands that's his nature. He understands that's who he wants to honor. Uprightness belongs to God. And regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the type of temptation, regardless of the pressure, he ends up in jail because of his uprightness. Because she lies. He tries to get out of there so fast he leaves a part of his coat. She tells her husband a lie about what really happened. He ends up in prison because of this. But he'd rather be upright and not sin against God and go to prison than to choose sin. Every sinful lifestyle, choice, behavior, whatever you want to call it, comes about by a series of choices. One decision after another. That's how I get there. And if I'm not honest about that process, if I'm not honest about that one moment that led to the next moment, that led to the next moment, that eventually hardens my heart, that eventually convinces me that my nature is just sinful anyway, and the next thing you know, nothing bothers me anymore. That's how I got there. And it often starts early. The Ecclesiastes writer, we often remember, right? Ecclesiastes chapter 12. We remember the commendation that the writer gives about remembering the Creator in the days of youth. When he simply said that, "Now remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years draw not near, when you say, I have no pleasure in them." Whether you consider yourself young or not tonight, you choose. But may I encourage all of us that the earlier we get on a path of uprightness, the better. The quicker we realize the nature of uprightness that God has instilled in us, the better off we will be. Because the days are going to come, the years are going to come, and the longer I wait, the longer I wait, the longer I wait, I can reach a point where I have no pleasure in them. That's exactly what Paul was trying to tell those folks in Ephesus not to do with the hardness of their hearts. Sometimes I got to a sinful state because it started early, and so the best way to stop that is to start early on the uprightness side. Notice verse 10 of Ecclesiastes chapter 11, which kind of led into this conversation of chapter 12. He says, "Therefore remove sorrow from your heart. Put away evil from your flesh. For childhood and youth are vanity. They flee away. Remember now your Creator. There's the flow. Friends, it starts early. The choices and decisions that lead me on a path of uprightness or consequence start early. Choose wisely. Because I can even start confusing the way I think about things very early on. In fact, that's what Satan does. The quicker he can get you to start thinking about your nature differently than how the Bible describes it, the better off Satan is in leading you down towards paths of sin. Verse 3, the wicked of Psalm 58. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born. Speaking lies. Now, it's poetic, right? It's a psalm. But what's the emphasis of that? He's trying to get the folks to recognize how quickly Satan can get folks down a path of sin. How quickly. Almost feels like it's just right out of the womb he's got them. Heading in the wrong direction. It can start very early, so be careful. Be careful of your choices. Be careful about what you think about your nature. Be careful about what you think about God's uprightness and the descriptions that are found within God's Word, friends. Choose wisely. Choose wisely. Because too often we've let the world define what is natural. And for those who want to live upright in the eyes of God, we have to let Him define that. We have to let Him choose that. And can I encourage you tonight as we wrap up this two-part lesson today, that why we need to think very soberly about sinful behaviors and choices is the price that was paid to remedy it. You think about that. It cost the God the Father His only begotten Son. We are His created children, created for His workmanship. We are adopted into His family by becoming joint heirs with Jesus through the power of Jesus' adoption process that He leads us to. We are granted all those blessings. But God the Father only has one that the Bible describes, only one begotten Son. And God the Father determines that that's the means by which He would remedy this challenge of men vacating the natural for the unnatural. The life choices men made led God to send His only begotten Son to remedy that problem. The Bible speaks about every time we sin, we crucify Jesus anew. Well, what's that mean? It means we have brought back to the surface the realities of the condemnation that sin has brought to us. Friends, when we choose sin, it's an element of disrespect for the Father who sent His only begotten Son to remedy sin. It's an element of disrespect to the Savior who came and suffered as a man and died the horrible death of the cross to save us from sin, not to allow us to continue in it, to give us an opportunity to recognize that when we have failed in that uprightness, here is the remedy. But the result of discipleship is to govern ourselves by the uprightness of God. That's what we're trying to get all of us to see today. To recognize the full consequence of sin, to recognize it is not the natural path, it is the unnatural path. And that when we will dedicate ourselves and exhort one another daily to live in uprightness that comes from God, we can avoid the consequences that sin brings. And when and if we do fail, we do have a remedy that is in the blood of Jesus Christ, but we don't take that for granted, and we don't abuse that privilege, and we don't act as if we deserved it in behaviors that keep putting Jesus back on the cross in that figurative language. Choose uprightness because that's who we are. Abhor evil because that's not not what we are. And recognize every sin that I've ever chosen in my life went against who God made me to be. And I want to be what God made me to be. That's what I want. That's what we want to choose. And if we could help you do that tonight, if we could help you step into the promises of God, to let Him have, as we're about to sing, let Him have His way, right? It's God's way. It's God's purposes. It's God's uprightness. If we could help you step into those promises tonight, find that remission of sins through baptism or to restore that relationship, pray for you tonight, encourage you in some way, or just be committed as you leave tonight to say, I'm going to live in the uprightness of God. But if we can help you in some way tonight, encourage you in some way, we'd invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.